Tonight, we're going to explore something that seems simple, but is actually one of the most shocking ideas in modern life. The internet disappearing. You've probably thought about the internet every day, used it thousands of times without even noticing. But here's what most people don't stop to realize. When you imagine it suddenly gone, when you truly think about how connected everything has become, it changes how you see our world. This is not just a small inconvenience. It's a loss so big that it challenges the way we live, work, and even think. And by the end of this journey, you're going to understand exactly why the internet matters more than we often admit, and why nothing else can replace it. Before we go any further, if you enjoy deep and careful explorations like this, a quick like or subscribe really helps the channel grow. It's a small thing for you, but it makes a huge difference for me. Now, let's begin. The day began like any other, with cities stirring to life, lights flickering on in offices, homes, and streets. People reached for their devices, tapping screens and scrolling feeds, expecting the usual flow of messages, notifications, and alerts. But in that instant, the familiar hum of connectivity ceased. Smartphones froze mid-animation. Computers displayed blank screens where emails should have appeared, and tablets sat idle as if the network they had always relied on had simply vanished. Across continents, undersea cables carried nothing. Routers blinked in repetitive confusion, and satellites that maintained constant communication fell silent. The invisible pathways that once connected billions of devices evaporated, leaving a world suddenly stripped of its digital pulse. Servers, once humming continuously, fell into quiet dormancy. Data centers, engineered to operate without pause, stood like empty warehouses, their racks of blinking lights dimmed to a near-constant state of inactivity. Cooling systems designed to maintain precise temperatures for uninterrupted service continued to operate, moving air through empty corridors, but the data itself had nowhere to travel. Internet service providers detected nothing beyond silence. Packets of information, which in ordinary conditions would leap from one network node to another in fractions of a second, found no destination, no routing, no recognition. The architecture of the web, intricate and vast, had become a structure of idle components, inert yet physically present. On a smaller scale, individual devices reacted differently, yet all shared the common trait of dependence lost. Smartphones, smartwatches, home assistants, and even simple laptops no longer displayed notifications, messages, or updates. Applications that relied on live connections failed gracefully or froze entirely. IoT devices, from thermostats to security cameras, paused in their programmed routines. Smart lighting systems did not adjust to preset schedules. Washing machines and refrigerators with networked sensors returned to manual default modes. The routines that had once been automated across countless homes became disrupted, and the absence of connectivity was tangible, though invisible. In cities, the impact was paradoxically silent yet pervasive. Streets were filled with people staring at blank screens, waiting for signals that would never arrive. Retail stores dependent on online ordering systems could no longer access product databases or payment gateways. Vehicles equipped with GPS navigation and traffic coordination systems experienced delays and rerouting failures. Digital billboards froze, their content cached and then stalled. Even transit information, which relied on live tracking and updates, disappeared, leaving commuters without real-time guidance. The rhythm of urban life intertwined with data streams had abruptly slowed. Across the world, the infrastructure supporting the internet also fell still. Undersea cables, stretching thousands of kilometers to link continents, remained physically intact but electrically silent. Routing centers, which had managed trillions of data exchanges, found their protocols halted, unable to reconcile the absence of signal. Satellite constellations orbiting the Earth, often used for redundancy and international data relay, emitted no usable communication. From the perspective of network engineers and system administrators, the digital world they had built continued to exist in hardware and wiring, but in practice, it was inert. There was no global internet in the functional sense, only disconnected devices and lifeless circuits. The immediate effects on human perception were subtle at first, a creeping sense that something essential had vanished. Many reached automatically for notifications, expecting the habitual stream of updates. When none appeared, a cognitive void emerged. The expectation of constant connection, conditioned over decades, became a stark contrast against the new, unresponsive reality. Sounds that were once familiar, the ping of messages, the whir of servers, the alert tones of notifications, were replaced by quiet. The absence was a sensory experience as much as a technological one, a vacuum where activity had always been expected. Humans, so integrated into the digital rhythm, experienced a sudden and profound disconnect from the information flows that had become invisible yet omnipresent. In offices and data-dependent industries, operations froze in place. Cloud-based collaboration tools failed, leaving teams unable to access shared documents or project updates. Digital whiteboards, calendars, and scheduling applications became inaccessible. Research institutions could not retrieve experimental data stored in distributed networks, and cloud simulations halted mid-computation. Scientific workflows, once reliant on continuous online access, paused in a state of suspended action. The invisible scaffolding that allowed large-scale collaboration across continents dissolved, and teams reverted to local resources, if any were available. Meanwhile, automated financial systems stalled. Stock markets, reliant on real-time data feeds, were unable to transmit orders. Payment processing networks froze, affecting transactions in retail, banking, and services. ATMs ceased operations where network authentication failed. Businesses that had relied on web-based accounting and inventory management could not access crucial records. Supply chains, carefully orchestrated through continuous online monitoring, faced immediate disruption. Factories dependent on digital coordination between suppliers, production lines, and logistics partners found processes interrupted, demonstrating how deeply the Internet had been woven into the machinery of commerce. Emergency and public service systems also encountered sudden complications. Dispatch centers, often reliant on digital mapping and communication tools, needed to revert to analog methods. Ambulances, fire services, and police units could no longer rely on GPS tracking, mobile data terminals, or cloud-based dispatching. Radio systems, landlines, and face-to-face communication became critical, yet these were slower, more cumbersome, and less efficient. The immediate response capability of such services was diminished, highlighting the extent to which real-time digital connectivity had become integral to modern safety infrastructure. Even in the private sphere, personal habits were upended. Streaming media stopped. Music and video applications froze or reverted to cached content. Cloud-stored photos and files were inaccessible. Communication with friends and family across distances became impossible without reverting to voice calls, letters, or in-person visits. Education systems reliant on online learning platforms paused, and students were left with physical materials or nothing at all. The sudden unavailability of information demonstrated a global dependence that had been nearly invisible, shaping routines and expectations in ways that were only apparent once the systems disappeared. The sensory experience of a disconnected world was paradoxical. Cities remained physically busy. People moved through streets, cars continued to operate, buildings remained active. But the invisible layer that had connected the world into a synchronized digital network no longer functioned. Human perception adjusted to an absence that was felt but not seen. The digital pulse that had become part of daily life, almost like the air or ambient temperature, had ceased, and the world was forced to confront the implications of life without instantaneous, global communication and data exchange. The silence was not merely auditory, but systemic, a pause in a layer of reality that had silently guided human activity for decades. The immediate observation was clear. The internet, though invisible, had been a foundational element of modern existence. Its sudden disappearance revealed the full scope of its integration, from the smallest personal device to the largest global network, and the impact of its absence resonated immediately across every sector of society. The world, in the first moments, was forced into a state of reckoning with a reality where digital connections no longer existed, leaving the human, technical, and institutional structures to adjust to an unfamiliar, disconnected rhythm. Once the initial silence settled, the deeper consequences of the Internet's disappearance became evident in communication. Emails, once sent and received in seconds, could not move across networks. Inboxes remained static, filled with undelivered messages and pending notifications. Professionals who depended on digital correspondence for scheduling, reporting, or collaboration found themselves unable to reach colleagues in other cities or countries. Instant messaging applications froze in place, leaving conversations incomplete and unread. Groups that had organized work, social events, or coordination entirely online suddenly faced the challenge of re-establishing connection through means that had once been considered obsolete. Video calls, which had become the norm for meetings, lectures, and personal contact, vanished instantly. Screens that had once displayed faces and voices from distant locations went dark. Conference rooms equipped for digital meetings were suddenly silent. Educational institutions could not broadcast lectures to remote students. Families, separated by thousands of kilometers, found that familiar voices and expressions were inaccessible. The invisible bridge that allowed real-time interaction across space had evaporated, leaving gaps in relationships, work, and learning that could not be quickly bridged. Social media, long a dominant platform for sharing and consuming information, ceased to operate. Newsfeeds stopped updating, notifications disappeared, and the continuous flow of shared content halted. People who relied on these platforms to follow current events, maintain friendships, or participate in communities suddenly found that the networks they had trusted to keep them connected were gone. The real-time pulse of human social interaction slowed to a trickle. Messages sent hours before remained unseen. Posts scheduled to appear never arrived, and online communities that spanned continents were frozen mid-discussion. In this absence, the scale of dependence on instant digital interaction became apparent. Journalism, which had adapted to rapid digital dissemination, faced immediate disruption. Online publications could not update articles, report breaking news, or distribute content to readers worldwide. News organizations that had relied heavily on cloud-based editing and storage systems were unable to access drafts, photographs, or multimedia files. Broadcast operations that use the internet to feed content to streaming platforms or coordinate live reports encountered delays. Information pipelines that had once delivered updates in seconds now required manual coordination. Reporters who depended on social media for sourcing stories, communicating with correspondents, or verifying facts were cut off from key tools. The continuity of global information flow was interrupted in a way that was unprecedented. Traditional broadcasting, such as television and radio, gained renewed importance. Without online distribution, stations returned to scheduled programming. Satellite feeds, cable networks, and terrestrial broadcasts became the primary methods of mass communication. In many regions, radio stations provided the fastest access to information, especially for emergency updates or public advisories. Communities adapted quickly, tuning into frequencies that had once been auxiliary, rediscovering a form of communication that relied entirely on one-way transmission rather than interactive networks. The contrast between the immediacy of the Internet and the slower rhythm of traditional media highlighted the degree to which modern society had shifted to a reliance on interconnected devices. Landline telephones, which had largely receded into the background of daily life, became essential once more. Businesses, families, and institutions had to revert to calling to relay messages, coordinate schedules, or confirm appointments. Exchanges that had been automated through digital networks adjusted to higher loads as people returned to voice communication. Where lines were available, calls connected reliably, but the volume of usage tested older infrastructure. Many households discovered that devices intended primarily for emergencies were now critical tools for sustaining communication. The pace of information exchange slowed to the limits of human speech, a stark contrast to the speed of data previously taken for granted. Postal systems also reasserted their role in communication. Letters, packages, and printed documents became the primary method for sending detailed information over distance. Governments, businesses, and individuals relied on post offices to transfer records, contracts, and official notifications. The logistical complexity of handling a surge in physical correspondence required adjustments in staffing, transportation, and scheduling. Postal delivery, once considered slow and outdated, became a vital link in a network of human interaction. Communities that had depended entirely on electronic messaging for years rediscovered the deliberate rhythm of written communication. In rural or remote areas, the absence of internet connectivity was less immediately disruptive, as many of these regions had maintained reliance on radio and physical communication methods. Yet even there, devices and systems that had been upgraded with digital dependence experienced sudden failure. Agricultural operations that used networked sensors for irrigation or weather monitoring lost immediate feedback, affecting timing and productivity. Local radio stations, however, continued to function and became critical nodes for coordination, advice, and social connection. The reliance on resilient, low-tech systems underscored the uneven global dependency on high-speed networks. Within organizations, internal communications suffered similarly. Intranets and cloud platforms, once taken for granted as central hubs of coordination, became inaccessible. Departments could not share updates, task lists, or documentation across office branches. Operations that had migrated entirely to digital collaboration faced immediate disruption, forcing employees to improvise analog systems. Meeting notes were scribbled on paper, memos physically circulated, and whiteboards replaced digital dashboards. These methods, slower and more labor-intensive, reminded societies of the mechanisms of communication that had existed before digital networks. The global scale of disruption revealed the extent to which society had become interconnected. People accustomed to instantaneous contact experienced isolation as hours passed, without response from colleagues, friends, or institutions. Emergency information that previously could have been disseminated digitally now relied on slower, more localized methods. Health advisories, transportation updates, and community notifications required coordination through broadcast or postal methods. The human response to this sudden collapse of communication highlighted both the fragility of modern networks and the resilience of older systems. In the absence of the Internet, communication became a study in adaptation. Those who could access radio, telephone, and mail adjusted quickly, establishing new routines for coordination and information flow. Businesses devised hybrid systems, combining analog methods with localized digital tools when networks remained functional. News agencies reverted to wire services and telephonic reporting, sometimes relying on couriers to transmit critical content. Educational institutions adapted curricula to printed materials or in-person instruction, supplementing with recordings distributed physically. Communities adjusted schedules to account for the slower pace of information, rediscovering patience and deliberate planning as integral to maintaining contact. The psychological effects of disrupted communication were subtle yet pervasive. The expectation of instant responses, instant verification, and instant updates had conditioned people to a certain rhythm. Its abrupt absence introduced uncertainty, anxiety, and the need to reassess methods of coordination. Individuals rediscovered the value of planning, double-checking, and confirming through alternative channels. The pace of life previously dictated by a constant flow of notifications slowed as people reoriented to analog tools. While initially disorienting, this adjustment revealed the durability of human networks capable of functioning without digital intermediaries, though at a diminished speed. By the end of the first days, it became clear that communication collapse affected every layer of society. From global enterprises to small households, the reliance on the Internet had become invisible yet foundational. Messages, whether for work, social life, or emergency management, could no longer traverse the planet in moments. Communities, organizations, and governments were forced to engage with methods that had long been secondary. The sudden return to these older systems highlighted the intricate balance between speed, reliability, and accessibility that the Internet had provided, and the stark consequences of its absence. The world was still connected physically, yet the invisible web that had woven these connections into instantaneous, global patterns had disappeared, leaving humanity to reconstruct channels of communication from the ground up. With communication silenced, the economic machinery of the world faced immediate paralysis. Stock exchanges, once pulsing with activity, froze as data feeds ceased. Traders staring at monitors saw numbers suspended mid-update, charts that no longer moved, and alerts that no longer arrived. The digital heartbeat that had allowed rapid buying and selling vanished in an instant. Orders that had been submitted seconds before remained unprocessed. Automated trading algorithms, designed to respond to market changes in milliseconds, halted. Across continents, financial markets paused in a state of suspended activity, unable to reconcile transactions or maintain continuity. Banking networks, reliant on online protocols for authentication, verification, and transfer, were also incapacitated. Credit and debit card payments failed at points of sale. ATMs that depended on real-time connections could not confirm balances. Wire transfers, electronic deposits, and online bill payments all stopped. Individuals and businesses alike faced the sudden reality that money in digital form was inaccessible. Banks maintained physical records, but access required manual processes that were slow, limited, and often unfamiliar to modern users. The speed of commerce, which had been built on instantaneous electronic transactions, came to a standstill. E-commerce, which had grown to dominate global retail, experienced immediate disruption. Orders placed through online platforms could not be confirmed, tracked, or delivered. Payment systems, dependent on secure live connections, failed to authorize purchases. Warehouses, whose inventory systems relied on cloud-based tracking, could not reconcile stock levels with pending orders. Automated fulfillment centers, designed to operate with minimal human intervention, found themselves inoperable. Retailers accustomed to real-time monitoring and logistics planning were forced to halt operations or rely on manual processes, often improvising in real time to avoid total shutdown. Supply chains for essential goods such as food, water, and fuel also suffered. Digital coordination platforms that had synchronized orders, deliveries, and storage facilities were offline. Distribution centers lacked updated information on demand or transportation schedules. Trucks carrying goods arrived at warehouses with no digital record of inventory needs. Ports and shipping operations, previously coordinated through network systems, were forced to rely on manual scheduling. The flow of goods slowed dramatically, and bottlenecks formed in key nodes of distribution. Perishable items, in particular, were at risk as timing became uncertain, and temperature-sensitive storage could not be monitored remotely. Energy sectors faced similar challenges. Smart grids, designed to balance supply and demand in real time, could no longer adjust based on usage data. Power plants continued to generate electricity, but distribution efficiency was reduced. Oil refineries, pipelines, and fuel distribution systems, coordinated digitally across regions, experienced delays. Operators had to rely on manual controls and pre-established schedules, often requiring more staff to manage systems safely. Even minor inefficiencies in energy supply were magnified across large networks, affecting industrial, commercial, and residential users simultaneously. Logistics companies, which had integrated GPS tracking and inventory software into every aspect of operations, struggled to maintain service. Deliveries, both local and international, faced delays as routing data became inaccessible. Warehouses could not monitor packages or shipments in real time, leaving uncertainty about the movement of goods. Businesses that had shifted to cloud-based coordination found that internal communications were slowed or fragmented. Drivers and operators needed to revert to paper manifests, verbal instructions, and on-the-ground decisions to keep transport moving. The efficiency once gained through digital tools disappeared almost instantly. Cloud-based businesses, whose entire operations relied on network services, faced cascading failures. Companies providing software, storage, or computational services found their infrastructure physically intact but functionally useless. Clients who depended on cloud access for day-to-day operations could no longer retrieve files, run applications, or maintain continuity. This disruption affected industries from finance to healthcare, from design to research. Even simple tasks, such as updating documents or accessing records, required workarounds that were slow and error-prone. The absence of digital access exposed vulnerabilities in businesses that had centralized their operations entirely online. Small businesses, often less resilient to systemic shocks, faced rapid adaptation challenges. Point-of-sale systems that relied on internet connectivity could not process sales. Inventory tracking, supplier coordination, and customer management were interrupted. Many owners resorted to cash transactions and handwritten records, Restaurants could not access online orders, retail shops could not verify stock or confirm payments, and service providers could not communicate with clients efficiently. The very practices that had allowed these businesses to scale and modernize became liabilities in a suddenly offline world. International trade, dependent on real-time communication and digital documentation, slowed. Customs declarations, shipping manifests, and import-export approvals could not be submitted electronically. Logistics companies needed to revert to physical paperwork, causing delays in ports, border crossings, and cargo handling. The global flow of goods, which had operated at near-instant speed through online systems, returned to a pace dictated by human processing, physical documents, and transportation limitations. This slowdown affected not only commercial sectors but also essential goods like medicines, medical equipment, and food supplies that traveled long distances. The psychological and operational impact on businesses was profound. Companies that had thrived on efficiency, speed, and global reach were forced to rethink priorities. Decisions that once took seconds through real-time data now required careful deliberation, verification, and manual coordination. Employees who had relied on network tools for collaboration and reporting experienced disorientation. Supply chain managers, logistics coordinators, and executives had to re-establish communication channels using slower, more labor-intensive methods. The pace of the economy, previously accelerated by digital integration, contracted abruptly to a level more in line with pre-digital methods. Financial institutions, supply chain managers, and retail operations began improvising to maintain continuity. Ledgers were updated manually, transactions logged by hand, and delivery schedules recalculated based on real-world observation rather than algorithmic prediction. Warehouses deployed staff to physically track inventory, and shipping companies relied on paper manifests and direct communication with drivers. While these measures maintained basic operations, efficiency dropped, errors increased, and the overall pace of commerce slowed. The invisible scaffolding that had sustained a digital economy was gone, leaving human management to shoulder the weight of coordination and oversight. The collapse also highlighted the interconnectedness of modern industries. A disruption in one sector rippled across others. Financial system paralysis affected suppliers, whose delayed payments impacted manufacturers. Logistics delays caused shortages in retail, affecting consumer availability and pricing. Energy distribution inefficiencies slowed industrial output. Cloud-based service interruptions halted administrative and operational tasks across multiple domains. The absence of the Internet revealed the hidden dependencies that had grown over decades of digital integration, showing that modern economic activity relied not only on individual systems, but on their constant real-time interaction. In the first days of economic paralysis, the limits of manual adaptation became clear. Companies and governments struggled to reconcile orders, track shipments, and maintain liquidity. Employees reverted to methods that were slower, more error-prone, and more labor-intensive. While physical infrastructure remained intact, the speed and efficiency of digital coordination were absent. Decisions that once relied on instantaneous computation and communication now required human oversight, slowing operations at every level. The immediate crisis underscored the fragility of an economy built on seamless, global digital networks, and the consequences of their sudden disappearance became visible in real-time disruption, delayed services, and a recalibration of how commerce could function without the Internet. As economic systems struggled, transportation and infrastructure immediately reflected the absence of the Internet. Air traffic control, a system reliant on constant data exchange, radar integration, and real-time communication with aircraft, became strained. Flights in mid-air continued on pre-programmed routes, but coordination between airports, controllers, and airlines slowed. Departure schedules were disrupted, gate assignments became uncertain, and baggage tracking systems froze. Pilots relied more heavily on radio communication and procedural flight plans, yet the volume of global air traffic created delays that could not be fully resolved without digital oversight. International routes that depended on automated systems for sequencing and collision avoidance were particularly affected, and backup manual procedures were tested under unprecedented pressure. Rail networks, similarly dependent on digital signaling, scheduling, and tracking systems, experienced slowdowns and interruptions. Train dispatchers, accustomed to monitoring routes via integrated software, had to switch to manual signaling and paper-based scheduling. Automated signals failed in some regions, requiring human operators to intervene at crossings and along tracks. Freight trains, which depended on digital manifests and location updates for coordination, faced delays as dispatchers recalculated routes by hand. Passengers experienced cancellations, rescheduled departures, and uncertainty about arrival times. The intricate orchestration of rail networks, optimized through real-time data, faltered, revealing the fragility of a system so deeply integrated with digital technology. On roads, ride-sharing platforms, which had grown ubiquitous, ceased operations. Drivers and riders could no longer coordinate through apps, leaving both to rely on phone calls, physical meetings, or local knowledge. Delivery services that had optimized routes based on GPS and traffic conditions could not provide accurate timelines or updates. Autonomous vehicles, from self-driving taxis to freight trucks, stopped functioning entirely when networked guidance systems failed. Vehicles equipped with traffic coordination sensors were unable to respond to changing conditions, leaving some intersections and highways congested as human operators attempted to manage traffic manually. The absence of internet-based control exposed the delicate balance of automated urban mobility. Smart traffic systems designed to adjust signals dynamically based on vehicle flow also became ineffective. Traffic lights reverted to preset timing patterns or default flashing modes in areas equipped with backup systems. Congestion increased as human drivers navigated roads without real-time information. Congested urban centers experienced delays in commuting, deliveries, and emergency response. The absence of live monitoring meant that road managers and city planners were forced to make reactive decisions rather than proactive adjustments, slowing the movement of goods and people. Coordination that had depended on invisible networks now required observation, judgment, and manual intervention. Emergency services faced new challenges as digital coordination systems went offline. Dispatch centers that manage fire, police, and medical response could no longer rely on integrated digital mapping, GPS tracking, or automated alerting systems. Emergency calls were still received through landlines and radio, but the speed of response was constrained by analog procedures. Ambulances, fire trucks, and police units were guided to incidents through verbal directions, paper maps, and local knowledge. Hospitals, relying on automated triage and resource allocation tools, had to manage incoming patients without real-time updates. The efficiency of public safety infrastructure was diminished, highlighting the reliance on online coordination for life-saving services. The distribution of fuel, which depended on digital tracking and scheduling, also slowed. Gas stations reliant on automated ordering systems could not receive replenishment requests electronically. fuel depots had to rely on manual logging and communication, and delivery trucks required human-managed routing. Industrial users, transportation companies, and private consumers experienced shortages or delays in obtaining fuel, creating a ripple effect across logistics, public transportation, and personal mobility. The absence of digital networks revealed the interdependence of energy supply and transportation management. Public transit systems were equally affected. Subways, buses, and commuter trains that depended on network ticketing and scheduling platforms could not provide live updates or manage passenger flow efficiently. Fare collection systems that relied on digital cards failed, requiring temporary measures or free travel in some cases. Schedules became estimates rather than precise timings, and riders adjusted by observing vehicles physically rather than relying on apps. City planners and transit authorities were forced to coordinate using radios, paper schedules, and in-person observation. While basic operations continued, efficiency and predictability suffered significantly. Shipping logistics, both local and international, faced immediate disruption. Ports, warehouses, and freight companies that depended on real-time tracking, automated scheduling, and digital documentation could no longer coordinate effectively. Cargo ships continued their courses based on existing plans, but docking schedules, customs clearance, and inventory tracking slowed to manual processing. The movement of goods, especially time-sensitive materials, experienced bottlenecks and delays. Employees and managers relied on handwritten logs, phone calls, and physical inspection to maintain operations, highlighting the contrast between prior digital efficiency and present analog constraints. Urban delivery systems, from food to consumer goods, were similarly challenged. Apps that had once coordinated thousands of deliveries per hour were offline. Couriers and drivers relied on paper manifests, pre-existing knowledge of routes, and direct communication with dispatchers. Delivery times became unpredictable, and efficiency dropped sharply. Perishable goods faced increased risk as schedules and storage were harder to coordinate. Residents and businesses accustomed to rapid digital ordering adjusted to slower, more deliberate logistics, rediscovering the importance of planning, timing, and local knowledge in transportation. The disruption extended to aviation ground operations as well. Baggage handling systems, automated check-in kiosks, and boarding procedures that relied on online databases and ticket verification faced interruption. Airport staff had to manage processes manually, coordinating with airlines and passengers directly. Delays multiplied, creating congestion both on the tarmac and inside terminals. Coordination that once relied on integrated software now required constant human oversight and intervention, slowing passenger flow and cargo movement alike. Highway and road maintenance operations also faced indirect effects. Many modern systems, including traffic monitoring cameras, digital signage, and automated road sensors, were rendered less effective. Road crews and municipal authorities relied on traditional observation and manual reporting to monitor conditions and manage repairs. Emergency repairs, detours, and safety warnings had to be communicated using local radio, signs, and in-person coordination. The absence of the internet highlighted how much modern infrastructure depended on invisible networks to function optimally. In the first days of offline transportation, people became acutely aware of the fragile balance maintained by digital coordination. Airports, rail hubs, ports, and city streets continued to operate, but with slower, more labor-intensive methods. Human observation, manual record keeping, and direct communication replaced automated monitoring, routing, and scheduling. Delays, congestion, and inefficiencies became common. While basic mobility remained possible, the disappearance of the Internet revealed the reliance of modern transportation on invisible, instantaneous networks and the challenges of restoring order without them. Over time, operators and authorities adapted. Air traffic controllers reverted to conventional flight separation techniques, scheduling takeoffs and landings with precise human coordination. Rail dispatchers prioritized critical freight and passenger lines, using manual signals to manage flow. City managers and traffic operators introduced fixed patterns, monitored intersections, and guided vehicles through observation. Delivery and logistics personnel relied on local knowledge to maintain routes. Even without online tools, essential transport continued, though efficiency and predictability remained diminished, and the invisible scaffolding of digital systems remained conspicuously absent. The effects of this collapse also highlighted interdependence across sectors. Transportation delays affected supply chains, emergency response, commerce, and even energy distribution. Vehicles carrying goods arrived later, airports faced backlogs of cargo and passengers, and city traffic slowed deliveries. The invisible threads that had connected production, movement, and consumption were no longer instantaneous, forcing society to operate at a speed dictated by human coordination rather than digital automation. The world continued to function, but the absence of real-time data and connected systems imposed limits on movement, timing, and efficiency previously taken for granted. With transportation slowed and commerce strained, the scientific world faced its own profound disruption. Laboratories that had depended on cloud-based storage discovered that vast amounts of research data were no longer accessible. Experiments conducted over months or years, meticulously recorded and uploaded for analysis, remained trapped on servers now offline. Teams that had coordinated across countries could not retrieve shared results, compare datasets, or verify findings. Even local copies were often incomplete, as the practice of centralizing data in cloud repositories had become standard. The physical presence of equipment and laboratories persisted, but the digital links that made large-scale research possible had vanished. Global research networks, which allowed institutions to share data in real time, became disconnected. Observatories, particle accelerators, and remote laboratories could no longer communicate effectively. Instruments that depended on networked control systems were forced into manual operation, if they could operate at all. For example, telescopes spread across different continents, designed to synchronize observations, could not exchange data or coordinate timing. Observing programs that relied on remote access were paused. Satellite communication, which enabled high-resolution imaging, environmental monitoring, and planetary observation, was disrupted. Researchers found themselves cut off from the streams of information that allowed continuous global monitoring. In particle physics, major experiments like those at CERN experienced immediate impact. Collider experiments, dependent on distributed computing to store and analyze petabytes of data, could no longer run large-scale simulations. Data collected from detectors remained on-site, but could not be processed in the global computing grid, halting analysis. Researchers could only examine previously downloaded datasets, and ongoing experiments requiring synchronized international collaboration were postponed. The high-speed networks that had once allowed thousands of physicists to work together simultaneously were no longer functional, and the collaborative momentum of decades slowed sharply. Space agencies also faced major consequences. NASA, ESA, and other organizations that relied on continuous data transmission from satellites, telescopes, and planetary probes, found that communication lines were broken. Instruments in orbit continued to collect raw data, but transmission to ground stations ceased. Weather satellites, Earth observation platforms, and scientific probes could not relay information in real time. Astronomers and space scientists lost access to streaming feeds from observatories, delaying the analysis of phenomena such as solar activity, asteroid trajectories, and cosmic events. Time-sensitive operations, such as satellite adjustments and mission control commands, required alternative methods and manual intervention, increasing the risk of delays and errors. Environmental monitoring networks were particularly affected. Systems tracking weather, earthquakes, volcanic activity, and climate indicators relied heavily on digital networks to collect, aggregate, and analyze information. Real-time feeds that had once allowed early warnings for storms, tsunamis, and seismic events stopped. Meteorologists could no longer access live satellite imagery, hindering forecasts and emergency preparedness. Earthquake sensors and seismic monitoring stations produced data that could not be transmitted instantly to research centers or disaster response agencies. Climate research, dependent on a constant flow of observational data from sensors and satellites worldwide, was slowed, leaving gaps in understanding that could not be filled until connectivity returned or alternative methods were employed. Disease tracking and public health research, increasingly digitized, faced new challenges. Global monitoring systems that collected epidemiological data, tracked outbreaks, and modeled disease spread became inaccessible. Researchers could not update case counts, analyze trends, or coordinate interventions across borders. Networks designed for rapid reporting of infectious disease incidents, including those supported by cloud-based databases and online dashboards, paused in operation. This disruption slowed decision-making for public health agencies and international organizations, highlighting the critical reliance on continuous digital information in managing global health. Oceanographic research also suffered. Sensor networks monitoring temperature, currents, and salinity continued to collect information autonomously, but could not transmit it to central repositories. Data from remotely operated underwater vehicles and buoys remained stored locally, inaccessible for real-time analysis. Scientists studying ocean circulation, marine ecosystems, and climate interactions were forced to rely on pre-existing datasets, delaying the study of events such as sudden temperature shifts, algal blooms, or migration patterns. The intricate coordination between vessels, satellites, and shore stations became fragmented, requiring manual, logging, and later transmission once alternate methods could be arranged. High-performance computing clusters used for simulations in physics, chemistry, and climate modeling were compromised when dependent on distributed networking for data access. Simulations paused mid-process if they required input from remote sources. Models of weather patterns, fluid dynamics, and molecular interactions slowed, as researchers could no longer feed large datasets into algorithms housed in networked supercomputers. Collaborative projects, in which multiple institutions contributed computational power and shared results in real time, experienced delays proportional to the loss of connectivity. Even local computations were constrained by limited access to supplementary data stored remotely. Geological research, including volcanology, seismology, and mining exploration, encountered similar interruptions. Sensor networks embedded in mountains and fault zones continued recording activity, but the inability to transmit data in real time reduced the capacity for early warnings. Geologists monitoring volcanic activity or seismic tremors had to rely on manual retrieval of data and local instrumentation. The latency introduced by this offline approach diminished the ability to respond to emerging threats with speed, forcing reliance on traditional observation and slower analytical methods. In space weather research, networks that monitor the Sun and its influence on Earth experience setbacks. Solar observation satellites, which provide real-time data on solar flares, magnetic storms, and cosmic ray flux, could no longer send timely updates to ground-based facilities. Space weather forecasting, critical for protecting satellites, electrical grids, and communication systems, was hampered. Researchers depended on archival data and predictive models, but the absence of live telemetry reduced situational awareness and the ability to provide immediate warnings to affected industries. Agricultural science, increasingly reliant on digital monitoring, faced similar hurdles. Remote sensors tracking soil moisture, nutrient levels, and crop growth ceased transmitting data to central systems. Farmers and researchers who had relied on networked analysis tools to optimize planting, irrigation, and harvesting schedules could no longer access automated insights. The coordination of regional agricultural planning, pest control interventions, and yield predictions became slower, forcing reliance on manual observation and traditional reporting methods. Agricultural research teams found that real-time analysis and data-driven decision-making had become impossible without the Internet. Large-scale ecological research, including studies of biodiversity and wildlife migration, also slowed. Camera traps, GPS collars, and satellite tracking devices continued gathering data, but could not communicate with research centers. Conservationists, ecologists, and park managers lost the ability to observe patterns in real time. Field teams had to manually retrieve data from sensors or rely on intermittent radio communication. The absence of instantaneous connectivity meant that observations that once informed rapid intervention, such as poaching alerts or habitat disruptions, were delayed. Climate research, dependent on a global network of atmospheric sensors, ocean buoys, and satellites, was particularly affected. Models predicting temperature changes, precipitation patterns, and extreme weather events required continuous streams of input data. Without live feeds, researchers could only work with incomplete datasets. Seasonal forecasts, early warning systems, and predictive climate modeling were delayed. Policy planning and mitigation strategies, which relied on updated scientific information, had to contend with gaps in knowledge that could affect decision-making at local, national, and international levels. International research collaborations experienced immediate coordination problems. Teams that had relied on shared online platforms for document editing, virtual meetings, and data sharing were forced to communicate through phone calls, faxes, or couriered documents. Scheduling experiments that required synchronized participation across continents became difficult. Peer review and collaborative publication slowed, as digital manuscript exchange was no longer possible. The collective pace of scientific progress, accelerated by instantaneous communication, returned to the limitations of human coordination alone. Experimental laboratories that used networked instruments encountered operational challenges. Microscopes, spectrometers, and sensors that required remote calibration or monitoring could no longer be controlled from distant computers. Laboratory automation systems halted, and technicians were required to manually operate equipment, record observations, and maintain conditions. Experiments that had relied on automated timing or continuous monitoring required human attention to prevent data loss or equipment failure. Precision tasks that were previously overseen digitally were now subject to the slower rhythm of human intervention. Observatories Studying transient celestial events, such as supernovae, gamma-ray bursts, or asteroid flybys, were hindered by the lack of real-time data exchange. Alerts that would have been distributed instantly across networks to multiple facilities were delayed or absent. Coordination of observations to maximize coverage and data collection was difficult, and the opportunity to capture ephemeral events diminished. Astronomy, which had grown increasingly collaborative and time-sensitive, was forced to rely on limited, localized observation methods. Epidemiological modeling also suffered. Global disease surveillance systems, dependent on continuous reporting and analysis, were offline. Tracking the spread of pathogens, predicting outbreak hotspots, and coordinating interventions required manual data aggregation. Public health agencies were forced to rely on slower, traditional reporting methods. Researchers could no longer rapidly update models or test hypotheses with fresh data, limiting responsiveness to emerging threats. The absence of the Internet revealed the fragility of a scientific ecosystem built on constant, high-speed connectivity. Laboratories, observatories, space agencies, and environmental monitoring networks continue to exist physically, but the lack of digital integration slowed analysis, coordination, and discovery. Researchers relied on manual methods, face-to-face coordination, and pre-existing local data. The rhythm of scientific work, previously synchronized globally, became localized, deliberate, and slower, constrained by human capacity to manage information without the invisible, instantaneous networks that had become essential to progress. As scientific systems struggled, society itself began to feel the absence of the Internet in a deeply personal way. Social media platforms, once central to daily routines, were suddenly gone. News feeds no longer updated, notifications disappeared, and the endless flow of posts and messages halted. People who had depended on these networks to maintain relationships, share experiences, and feel connected experienced a sudden dislocation. The psychological impact was immediate. The quiet absence of interaction produced anxiety, restlessness, and a sense of isolation. For many, the rhythm of daily life had been synchronized to the cadence of likes, comments, and alerts. Now that rhythm vanished, leaving people unmoored from the digital routines that had structured their social lives for years. The loss of streaming services amplified this effect. Music, films, and television shows that had been available on demand disappeared, leaving empty spaces in schedules and habits. Users who had relied on these platforms for entertainment, education, or relaxation found themselves searching for alternatives. The absence of instantly accessible media forced households to rely on whatever physical content was available. CDs, DVDs, printed books, and traditional broadcast media. The immediacy of choice, which had become an expectation, was replaced with limitation, prompting a re-evaluation of what had been taken for granted in leisure and cultural consumption. Online communities, from forums to hobbyist groups, ceased to operate. Enthusiasts who had gathered digitally to discuss interests, share knowledge, or collaborate were cut off from networks that had once connected them across continents. Educational discussion groups, fan communities, and professional networks became inactive. The absence of these virtual spaces meant that people had to seek local, physical connections to maintain similar interactions. Clubs, libraries, classrooms, and community centers regained importance, serving as meeting points and sources of shared knowledge, a role they had lost to online connectivity over decades. The disappearance of digital archives and libraries also had a profound impact. Collections of knowledge, research papers, literature, and historical records stored online were suddenly inaccessible. Students, researchers, and the general public could no longer access e-books, scholarly articles, or databases that had become central to education and cultural preservation. Information that had once been available in seconds required physical retrieval or reliance on locally stored materials. This highlighted the fragile dependency of human memory on digital storage and the vulnerability of knowledge that existed only in cloud-based systems. Cultural production, from independent artists to global publishers, was disrupted. Artists who shared work digitally could not reach audiences, and collaborative projects relying on cloud-based editing or hosting were paused. Musicians, writers, and creators faced delays in distribution and promotion. The mechanisms that allowed rapid, global dissemination of culture were absent, and creators turned to physical media, print distribution, and face-to-face sharing. The pace of cultural exchange slowed dramatically, revealing how the Internet had transformed production, collaboration, and audience engagement into an instantaneous global process. The psychological reliance on digital affirmation became visible as people adjusted to the absence of notifications and virtual feedback. Habits formed around social validation, checking for likes, comments, or new followers, were disrupted, leaving a vacuum in daily activity. Individuals had to find alternative methods for social connection and personal reflection. Many returned to writing letters, keeping journals, or speaking directly with friends and family to replace the interactions previously mediated through screens. The adaptation was gradual and required conscious effort to reconstruct social bonds that had been maintained digitally. In households, leisure routines shifted toward physical media and analog experiences. Families rediscovered printed books, board games, and radio broadcasts. Television programming regained a central role, relying on scheduled content rather than on-demand streams. Music players, compact discs, and physical recordings re-emerged as primary sources of entertainment. The absence of streaming reshaped daily life, imposing slower rhythms, longer planning, and shared attention to material that could be held and experienced directly. The tactile and temporal nature of physical media contrasted sharply with the instant gratification previously provided by digital access. Education systems also adapted to the offline reality. Students who had relied on e-learning platforms, digital textbooks, and online lecture materials were forced to use printed resources and in-person instruction. Classrooms became the central venue for learning, and libraries regained significance as repositories of accessible knowledge. Teachers developed schedules that accounted for the slower dissemination of information and the limited reach of offline resources. Lessons and assignments that had been delivered and submitted digitally were now paper-based. Learning moved at a deliberate pace, constrained by physical materials and human delivery, rather than digital immediacy. Local media regained prominence. Newspapers, radio, and television broadcasts became primary sources of news and entertainment. Journalists and editors who had relied heavily on online platforms for distribution adapted to the slower cycles of print deadlines and broadcast scheduling. Communities became more localized in their consumption of information, and coverage focused on regional events and concerns. The absence of global, instantaneous news feeds encouraged citizens to rely on nearby sources, sometimes strengthening local cohesion and awareness, even as access to distant events diminished. Physical libraries, archives, and museums became essential centers for both education and cultural engagement. Researchers, students, and curious citizens relied on tangible collections for study, replacing digital searches with in-person exploration. The slower pace of information retrieval encouraged more deliberate examination of materials, fostering depth over speed. Historical documents, books, and records were examined directly, creating an experiential dimension that had been largely absent in online browsing. The interaction with physical artifacts reinforced the reality that knowledge is not only stored digitally, but also embedded in tangible, human-curated spaces. Offline social gatherings regained significance. Book clubs, hobbyist groups, and local societies became primary forums for exchange of ideas. Discussions, debates, and collaborative activities returned to spaces that required physical presence. Human interaction, unmediated by screens, developed new rhythms, relying on attention, observation, and face-to-face communication. Community centers, cafes, and public squares became hubs of connection, replacing the ubiquitous digital spaces that had once allowed instant global engagement. Sociality became slower, deliberate, and dependent on presence rather than virtual participation. Religious and cultural institutions also experienced a resurgence of significance. Places of worship, community halls, and local centers provided spaces for gatherings, learning, and social cohesion. Events that had once been live-streamed or coordinated digitally were now experienced directly. Attendance patterns changed, and rituals were performed with renewed emphasis on in-person participation. These spaces offered stability and continuity in a world suddenly disconnected from digital networks, providing cultural anchors in the absence of online communities. Mental health patterns shifted. The constant stimulation and rapid information flow that had defined digital life were replaced by slower, more reflective rhythms. Some individuals experienced relief from constant notifications and social comparison, while others faced isolation and anxiety due to the loss of immediate social contact. Coping strategies developed through analog methods, reading, letter writing, physical exercise, and direct conversation. Communities and families adapted, finding new patterns for engagement and emotional support in a world without digital intermediaries. Even entertainment industries, which had grown globally interconnected, adjusted to the offline reality. Movie theaters, libraries, music stores, and live performance venues became central points of cultural consumption. Physical media distribution networks regained importance, and local production of content increased as digital channels ceased to operate. Artists, writers, and performers found audiences through tangible interaction rather than virtual platforms, and cultural exchange slowed, emphasizing quality and deliberation over speed and breadth. In the absence of digital archives, collective memory became more fragile, yet more tangible. Physical books, newspapers, and local records assumed renewed significance. Communities preserved knowledge and history through printed materials and personal documentation. Individuals recorded experiences in notebooks and journals, and storytelling gained prominence as a means of passing information. The loss of instantly accessible global memory emphasized the importance of local, durable, and material preservation of knowledge. Society began to reflect on the pace and nature of information. With the internet gone, humans experienced a slower, more deliberate engagement with news, entertainment, and culture. Attention spans adapted, patience returned, and curiosity became active rather than reactive. Communities rediscovered methods for sharing knowledge, maintaining traditions, and participating in cultural life that did not depend on constant connectivity. People engaged with information at the speed of human interaction, rather than the speed of servers and networks. The shock to daily life was profound, but also adaptive. People learned to live without the instant gratification of social media, streaming, and online communities. Physical books, newspapers, libraries, and live media regained prominence. Communities rebuilt local networks of social, educational, and cultural engagement. Society experienced a pause that, while disorienting, revealed resilience, the persistence of cultural transmission, and the enduring value of human interaction outside digital networks. Habits adjusted, expectations shifted, and life became slower, but grounded in tangible, accessible forms of knowledge and connection. Even as daily routines resumed in this slower mode, the absence of digital media remained a constant reminder of dependence. People became conscious of the fragility of their previous cultural ecosystem, understanding that global access and instantaneous participation had masked a reliance that could vanish without warning. Offline life required creativity, resourcefulness, and intentionality. In learning, entertainment, communication, and memory, humanity adapted to a physical, analog framework that demanded engagement, presence, and patience in ways digital life had long obscured. The cultural rhythm shifted, emphasizing tangible interaction, local knowledge, and deliberate experience over instant, ephemeral connectivity. As society adjusted to slower rhythms, the strain on health and emergency systems became immediately visible. Hospitals that had relied on digital records found themselves confronting an abrupt absence of patient information. Electronic medical records, accessible instantly through networked systems, were now unavailable. Doctors, nurses, and administrative staff scrambled to access printed charts, personal notes, and local backups. Patients arriving for treatment required staff to manually reconstruct histories, allergies, medications, and previous diagnoses. The lack of centralized data slowed triage, delayed procedures, and increased the potential for errors, even as medical professionals worked tirelessly to maintain care. Diagnostic networks, once connected across hospitals, laboratories, and imaging centers, ceased functioning. Lab results, imaging scans, and test interpretations that had been transmitted electronically could not be retrieved or shared in real time. Clinicians waiting for blood work, pathology reports, or radiology images faced delays. Equipment that depended on network connectivity for analysis, calibration, or remote monitoring could not operate at full capacity. Doctors often had to rely on direct observation, basic tools, or manual processing methods, substituting judgment and experience for the speed and precision of automated systems. Telemedicine, which had become a central element of patient care, particularly in rural or underserved regions, stopped entirely. Video consultations, remote monitoring devices, and virtual follow-ups were unavailable. Patients who had depended on digital access to healthcare faced travel to physical facilities, sometimes over long distances. Doctors who managed patient populations across regions could no longer monitor vital signs remotely or provide immediate advice. The absence of internet-based medical care forced communities to rely on local providers, slowing response times and reducing reach. Pharmaceutical supply chains were similarly disrupted. Digital inventory systems, order platforms, and automated fulfillment centers could not operate. Pharmacies that relied on electronic systems to request restocking or track controlled substances were forced to communicate manually with distributors. Hospitals and clinics found it difficult to maintain consistent supplies of essential medications, including antibiotics, insulin, and emergency drugs. Manufacturing plants, dependent on networked coordination for raw materials, production scheduling, and distribution, experienced delays, compounding the challenge of delivering critical pharmaceuticals to healthcare providers. Public health monitoring, from disease tracking to vaccination programs, slowed dramatically. Systems that collected and aggregated data from hospitals, clinics, laboratories, and public health agencies could not function. Real-time updates on outbreaks, epidemic patterns, and immunization coverage were inaccessible. Vaccination campaigns, previously coordinated through digital records and scheduling platforms, had to revert to paper-based lists and local outreach. Tracking disease progression became slower and less precise, forcing officials to rely on periodic reports, personal communication, and manual observation. Global surveillance networks, designed to provide rapid alerts for emerging threats, were interrupted, leaving gaps in monitoring and response. Emergency protocols shifted to manual systems, testing the preparedness of institutions under stress. Ambulances, fire departments, and police units could no longer rely on GPS tracking, automated dispatch, or digital routing. Call centers reverted to telephone and radio communication, requiring more staff to manage the same volume of incidents. Coordination between hospitals, emergency responders, and public health officials depended on manual reporting, physical travel, and in-person meetings. Response times increased, and resource allocation became more challenging, forcing personnel to make decisions with limited real-time information. Intensive care units, which had integrated networked monitoring for patient vital signs, infusion pumps, and ventilator management, faced new constraints. Systems that had allowed centralized observation of multiple patients simultaneously were inoperable. Nurses and doctors had to monitor devices individually, record observations manually, and adjust treatment without digital alerts. The loss of automated monitoring increased the workload, requiring constant vigilance and reducing the margin for error. Staff relied on traditional checks, frequent rounds, and direct observation to maintain patient safety. Surgical procedures, while continuing, were affected by the absence of integrated digital systems. Operating rooms that depended on networked imaging, electronic checklists, and coordination platforms had to manage manually. Surgeons prepared for procedures with printed or memory-based information. Post-operative care, which often relied on digital tracking of patient progress and lab results, reverted to paper charts and direct observation. Coordination between surgical teams, anesthesiologists, and support staff required greater communication and human oversight. Medical research, particularly trials involving real-time monitoring of patients or multi-center collaboration, slowed as well. Clinical trials that relied on online data, collection, electronic consent forms, and digital reporting had to be suspended or adapted to offline methods. Researchers depended on physical record keeping and local management, increasing the time required to gather, verify, and analyze data. The loss of immediate data access delayed results, constrained oversight, and limited the ability to detect adverse events quickly. Mental health services also faced disruption. Online counseling, therapy sessions, and digital support communities ceased. Patients who had relied on virtual access to psychologists, psychiatrists, and support networks had to transition to phone calls, in-person visits, or community-based resources. Therapists and support workers had to manage caseloads manually, schedule sessions individually, and coordinate follow-up without automated reminders. Individuals with urgent mental health needs were particularly vulnerable during the sudden adjustment, and local networks became critical for ongoing support. Public health logistics, such as blood supply, organ transport, and emergency medical deliveries, were significantly affected. Systems that monitored stock levels, coordinated donor matches, and tracked delivery routes could not operate digitally. Blood banks and transplant centers relied on human communication, manual scheduling, and direct transport coordination. Delays in obtaining materials, coordinating teams, and delivering critical resources had immediate consequences for patient care and outcomes, illustrating the deep interdependence of medical services on real-time digital systems. Vaccination campaigns faced additional challenges. Automated reminder systems, patient registration, and tracking of immunization status were no longer functional. Clinics and health workers reverted to physical lists and manual record keeping. Outreach to rural or mobile populations slowed, and coverage data became less precise. Coordination between regional health authorities and local clinics relied on telephone, in-person visits, and paper documentation, reducing the efficiency of preventive medicine efforts. Timely response to outbreaks or seasonal diseases was constrained by these limitations. Pharmacies managing controlled medications were forced to implement manual verification systems. Tracking prescriptions, monitoring refills, and ensuring compliance with regulations required staff to maintain careful paper records. Delays in verification increased the administrative workload, and potential for error increased. Patients experienced longer wait times, and healthcare providers had to adapt to slower communication with suppliers and regulatory authorities. The reliability and precision of previously automated systems became dependent on human diligence. Medical education and training adapted to the offline environment. Students and residents who had relied on digital resources, online simulations, and remote lectures turned to printed textbooks, in-person instruction, and hands-on practice. Learning required deliberate attention and manual coordination, emphasizing direct observation, repetition, and experiential engagement. Continuing education programs for professionals also shifted to offline methods, with seminars, workshops, and in-person guidance replacing digital courses and webinars. Public emergency planning, including disaster preparedness and crisis coordination, relied on analog methods. Coordination between hospitals, emergency management agencies, and government officials used telephone trees, in-person meetings, and manual reporting. Simulation exercises that had been conducted online or with digital modeling had to be replaced with practical drills and planning sessions. Resource allocation, logistics, and communication were slowed, and human oversight became essential in maintaining operational continuity during crises. Medical supply management, beyond pharmaceuticals, was also constrained. Equipment such as ventilators, diagnostic, tools, and surgical instruments, which had been tracked digitally for location, maintenance, and availability, required manual monitoring. Distribution centers, hospitals, and clinics relied on human operators to ensure equipment was delivered, maintained, and deployed efficiently. Planning for emergencies, elective procedures, and routine care required detailed manual coordination to compensate for the lack of digital oversight. The absence of networked laboratory systems slowed the testing of emerging pathogens and critical diagnostics. Automated reporting of results from labs to hospitals, research centers, and public health authorities was unavailable. Epidemiologists and clinicians relied on direct phone calls, couriered reports, and manual aggregation of data. Identifying infection clusters, responding to outbreaks, and tracking laboratory confirmations required additional staff and time. The delay in information flow had cascading effects on disease control, treatment, planning, and public health decisions. Medical imaging centers, which relied on networked storage and analysis, faced operational delays. X-rays, CT scans, and MRIs required manual handling of images, physical transfer between facilities, and interpretation without automated tools. Radiologists adjusted workflows to prioritize urgent cases and coordinated directly with clinicians to ensure timely diagnosis. The precision and speed afforded by digital image sharing and analysis were replaced with deliberate, human-centered methods. As healthcare systems adapted, staff ingenuity became critical. Hospitals, clinics, and public health organizations developed manual protocols for nearly every aspect of care. Written logs replaced electronic records, in-person coordination replaced digital communication, and physical distribution replaced automated supply chains. Despite the strain, personnel maintained operations, demonstrating adaptability in the face of digital absence. The speed and efficiency of modern medicine were reduced, but essential services continued through human effort and careful organization. Even preventive care and chronic disease management adjusted. Clinics tracked patient visits, medication schedules, and follow-up appointments manually. Healthcare workers contacted patients individually, maintained paper records, and relied on local coordination for service delivery. Chronic conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, and respiratory illness required consistent monitoring, and manual methods became essential for continuity. Patients adapted to slower communication and more deliberate interaction with care providers. The cumulative effect of these disruptions revealed the centrality of the Internet in modern healthcare. Medical records, diagnostic systems, telemedicine, supply chains, and emergency response relied on digital connectivity for speed, coordination, and precision. When that connectivity disappeared, hospitals and public health systems reverted to slower human-driven methods. Care continued, but the margin for error increased, response times lengthened, and the efficiency of complex operations diminished. Professionals relied on observation, memory, and direct communication to compensate for the sudden absence of digital infrastructure, demonstrating resilience under pressure while highlighting the fragility of modern health systems dependent on the Internet. As healthcare stabilized under human-driven systems, attention turned to security, governance, and defense, where the absence of the Internet produced effects both visible and hidden. Cybersecurity threats, once a constant concern, suddenly disappeared in the digital sense. Malicious actors could no longer launch online attacks, and data breaches were impossible in real time. Yet this absence did not equate to safety. Critical governance and military systems, deeply dependent on networked communication, digital coordination, and real-time intelligence, faced unprecedented challenges. Protocols designed for instant data sharing, remote command, and automated monitoring were interrupted, leaving institutions exposed and operationally slowed. National security networks, from intelligence gathering to surveillance operations, lost the ability to function at previously maintained speeds. Digital feeds from reconnaissance satellites, drone missions, and sensor networks were no longer accessible. Agencies responsible for monitoring threats relied on localized manual observation and physical reports. Information that had once moved instantly across secure networks now required couriered documentation or voice communication via phone lines and radios. Analysts could no longer integrate streams of data in real time, limiting situational awareness and the ability to respond rapidly to emerging crises. Military operations, including coordination of troops, logistics, and strategic planning, experienced similar constraints. Command and control systems that had relied on secure online networks for real-time updates, mission tracking, and communication with units in the field became less effective. Troops depended on traditional radio communication, visual signals, and in-person briefings. Supply chains for equipment, fuel, and munitions required manual oversight, and coordination between domestic and overseas bases slowed. Exercises and operational planning had to adapt to the absence of instant data sharing, relying on human judgment and slower procedural methods. Surveillance systems, critical for monitoring national borders, urban security, and sensitive sites, were constrained. Cameras, motion detectors, and automated alerting systems that depended on digital networks could no longer provide live feeds or instant notifications. Human patrols and direct observation replaced automated monitoring, increasing labor demands and slowing detection response times. Facilities that had relied on networked alarms, access controls, and digital tracking of personnel implemented analog substitutes, physical locks, manual logging, and scheduled patrols. Security effectiveness remained, but responsiveness was reduced. Critical infrastructure protection faced new vulnerabilities. Energy grids, water treatment plants, and nuclear facilities, which had grown dependent on networked monitoring and automated control systems, could not operate with the same precision. Operators had to rely on manual control panels, physical inspections, and direct coordination to maintain stability. Energy distribution required careful human oversight to prevent outages or overloads, and water treatment monitoring depended on analog meters and on-site observation. Nuclear facilities, which depended on digital monitoring for safety, switched to backup systems and human checks. The risk of errors increased, requiring heightened vigilance, routine inspection, and adherence to conservative operational protocols. The absence of digital intelligence also disrupted early warning systems for critical threats. Natural hazards, industrial accidents, or potential security breaches required rapid reporting and coordinated responses. Without instant communication, officials relied on telephone trees, in-person messengers, and physical logs. This slower process introduced delays in decision-making, resource allocation, and containment of emergent situations. Even routine monitoring that had been automated now required active human oversight, reducing efficiency and extending response times. International coordination and diplomacy were affected as well. Governments accustomed to digital communication, secure email, and instant access to intelligence could no longer coordinate seamlessly. Multilateral meetings, treaty negotiations, and crisis management shifted to physical correspondence, telephone communication, and in-person gatherings. Information sharing between allied nations slowed, requiring verification and repeated exchanges to compensate for the absence of instant updates. The speed of international decision-making declined, and real-time situational awareness in crises became more fragmented. Border security and customs enforcement, increasingly reliant on digital databases, surveillance cameras, and biometric verification, faced delays and increased workloads. Travelers, cargo shipments, and trade inspections required manual checks, paper documentation, and personal verification. Cross-border intelligence sharing, once instantaneous, returned to the limitations of couriered reports and direct communication. Security agencies adapted by prioritizing critical checkpoints and monitoring high-risk activities manually, but throughput and efficiency declined noticeably. Emergency response systems for civil defense, including evacuation planning, disaster management, and public alerts, adjusted to the absence of online coordination. Digital messaging, automated sirens, and mobile alerts were unavailable. Civil protection agencies relied on local radio, telephone networks, and in-person coordination to communicate warnings and mobilize resources. Communities adapted, designating local leaders and establishing manual communication chains to ensure information reached residents during crises. Although slower, these methods preserved functionality and maintained basic public safety. Intelligence networks responsible for counter-terrorism and criminal monitoring were similarly constrained. Digital databases, automated analytics, and surveillance feeds were inaccessible. Agents had to rely on field reports, direct observation, and coordination through traditional communication channels. Pattern recognition, predictive modeling, and cross-referencing of data, once facilitated by algorithms and online tools, were replaced by human analysis, observation, and experience. Investigations slowed, and the scope of monitoring became more localized and deliberate. Military logistics for operations, training, and supply distribution adjusted to manual management. Shipments of fuel, ammunition, and supplies required careful planning and physical verification. Routes for troop movements were coordinated using maps, couriers, and scheduled communications rather than real-time GPS updates. The absence of digital coordination required redundancy and precaution in planning, ensuring that essential operations continued without relying on online systems. Exercises and deployments operated at a slower tempo, emphasizing reliability over speed. Command structures that had depended on networked communication tools adapted with tiered reporting and in-person briefings. Officers and administrators relayed information through chains of responsibility, coordinating activities across regions manually. Strategic decisions required careful assembly of reports from multiple sources, verification through direct communication, and deliberate dissemination to operational units. The agility afforded by digital systems was replaced by slower, human-managed processes, demanding careful oversight and clear procedural discipline. Intelligence analysis, once supported by automated pattern recognition and data aggregation, reverted to manual review. Analysts examine reports, photographic evidence, and physical documents without the aid of algorithms or online databases. Collaboration between analysts and field agents required physical meetings or secure voice communication. While accuracy could be maintained, the speed at which information could be integrated and interpreted decreased, limiting the capacity for immediate response to emergent threats or fast-changing situations. Energy sector monitoring, including electricity grids and power generation, relied on human operators to maintain stability. Automated grid balancing, load distribution, and outage prediction systems were unavailable. Engineers monitored flow, voltage, and frequency using analog instruments and manual logging. Control decisions were based on observation and experience rather than real-time predictive models. Failures or overloads required immediate manual intervention to prevent cascading disruptions. Water and wastewater facilities similarly depended on human oversight to ensure continuity of service, with operators conducting frequent inspections and manual adjustments. Nuclear plants, which had integrated digital safety monitoring, relied on physical inspections and redundant mechanical systems. Safety protocols demanded continuous human presence and verification of readings. Automated alerting, remote diagnostics, and data logging systems were replaced by direct observation, physical measurement, and conservative operational procedures. Operators increased redundancy in monitoring and maintained meticulous logs, understanding that the margin for error had narrowed without digital oversight. Diplomatic communications, international agreements, and treaty enforcement adapted to slower methods. Embassies relied on secure physical correspondence, telephone communication, and in-person negotiation. Multinational organizations could not transmit real-time data, so decision-making cycles lengthened. Coordination during crises, such as territorial disputes or emergency responses, depended on slower information relay, requiring trust in manual verification and human judgment. Nations adjusted to a pace dictated by direct interaction rather than instantaneous digital exchange. The absence of networked intelligence also highlighted vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. Coordination between utilities, transportation systems, and emergency services required increased vigilance and proactive management. Manual checks, routine inspections, and on-site observation replaced automated alerts and predictive systems. Operators communicated through traditional channels, relying on established human procedures rather than digital oversight. The resilience of physical systems was tested as institutions compensated for the sudden loss of speed, automation, and instant information. Even in peacetime operations, the absence of internet connectivity reshaped governance. Policy decisions, administrative tasks, and interagency communication required slower, more deliberate processes. Officials depended on physical documentation, in-person meetings, and telephone communication. The speed and reach of governmental action contracted, emphasizing careful coordination, verification, and procedural discipline. Society operated at a tempo governed by human transmission of information rather than digital networks, reinforcing the importance of adaptability, redundancy, and resilience in critical governance and security systems. The cumulative effect of these changes revealed the deep integration of the Internet into national defense, security, and governance. While cyber threats vanished, the tools that had relied on digital infrastructure ceased to function effectively. Military operations, intelligence gathering, infrastructure protection, and international coordination adapted to human-driven methods. Manual procedures, analog monitoring, and physical communication became essential for maintaining stability, safety, and continuity. Institutions learned to operate with reduced speed and precision, emphasizing the human element in protecting society when digital networks were suddenly absent. With the collapse of digital systems persisting for weeks and months, humans began to adjust in ways that were subtle but significant. Communication returned to older methods. Mail carriers and postal services, once largely secondary to emails and instant messaging, regained central importance. Letters, notices, and packages moved along physical routes, requiring careful scheduling and attention. Communities relied on newspapers and printed bulletins to share information, distributing knowledge in tangible form. Radio broadcasts became critical, providing not only news but guidance for daily life, announcements, and emergency instructions. People tuned in at set times, listening attentively, creating a rhythm of information that depended on presence and focus rather than instant connectivity. In parallel, individuals and organizations reconstructed local networks. Community centers, libraries, and schools became hubs for information exchange and coordination. Meetings were held in person, allowing direct observation, conversation, and collaboration. Neighborhood committees organized resources, distributed news, and helped maintain infrastructure manually. Without the Internet to reach distant contacts instantly, people concentrated on strengthening bonds with nearby neighbors and local institutions. The pace of activity slowed, but cohesion within local communities increased, emphasizing cooperation and mutual assistance. Economic activity adapted to the new offline reality. Cash returned to prominence as digital payment systems failed. People carried physical currency, coins, and banknotes, trading for goods and services directly. Markets adjusted, reviving traditional methods of transaction, record keeping, and inventory management. In some regions, barter systems emerged, with goods exchanged directly when currency was scarce or unavailable. Local commerce became more self-contained, emphasizing reliability, trust, and direct accountability, rather than speed or convenience. Small businesses adapted to manual bookkeeping, in-person orders, and physical delivery of goods, gradually reconstructing functioning supply chains without digital assistance. Manual logistics became essential across all sectors. Stores, factories, and distribution centers relied on paper-based scheduling, telephone coordination, and physical record keeping. Orders were written down, transported manually, and verified in person. Warehouses required staff to monitor inventory, without automated systems, ensuring that essential goods reached communities efficiently. Transportation depended on human planning, analog tracking, and careful sequencing of deliveries. Even complex supply networks, once optimized through digital tools, were reconstructed using meticulous manual organization and persistent attention to detail. In agriculture, farmers returned to analog methods of monitoring soil, crops, and livestock. Irrigation schedules, fertilization routines, and harvest planning were recorded by hand, relying on observation rather than sensors. Local agricultural offices coordinated resources, provided advice, and maintained communal knowledge in physical forms. Traditional techniques, supplemented with observational science, allowed production to continue without dependence on online guidance or digital datasets. Markets adjusted with direct communication between producers, distributors, and retailers, emphasizing reliability and trust in human coordination. Healthcare systems continued to adapt in similar ways. Hospitals maintained manual records, coordinated supply chains for medications and equipment, and relied on personal communication for emergency response. Patients adapted to longer appointment times, physical follow-up procedures, and in-person consultations. Preventive care programs relied on printed logs, telephone reminders, and community engagement. Public health authorities coordinated vaccination campaigns, disease monitoring, and emergency protocols using analog methods, reinforcing the importance of human diligence, observation, and deliberate organization. Education adjusted to a slower, more deliberate rhythm. Schools and universities relied on printed textbooks, in-person lectures, and physical assignments. Students participated in structured learning environments, attending classes, reading materials by hand, and submitting work in paper form. Teachers and administrators tracked attendance, performance, and progress manually, emphasizing direct feedback and observation. Libraries regained central importance as sources of knowledge, and study groups met in person to collaborate. Learning became more methodical, requiring patience and sustained focus. Entertainment and culture shifted to offline formats. Families and communities engaged in board games, printed books, local theatre, music, and radio programming. Artists distributed work physically through galleries, bookstores, and live performances. Community events became key venues for sharing stories, art, and information. The pace of cultural consumption slowed, allowing deeper engagement, reflection, and appreciation. Without the constant distraction of digital media, attention became more sustained and deliberate, reinforcing connection and shared experience. Social habits transformed under the slower rhythm of life. People developed patience, focusing on in-person interactions and conversations. Community gatherings, family dinners, and casual meetings regained significance. Without instant messaging or social media, communication required presence, observation, and attentiveness. Relationships deepened in localized contexts, and trust became more tangible as interactions occurred directly rather than mediated through screens. Social norms shifted toward personal engagement, deliberation, and careful consideration of information before sharing or acting. Governance adapted through human networks. Officials relied on in-person meetings, telephone coordination, and printed communication. Administrative processes, policy implementation, and public services moved at a pace determined by human capacity rather than digital speed. Coordination between agencies relied on clear procedures, redundancy, and documentation. Decision-making became more measured, with increased attention to verification and careful oversight. Local leaders assumed more responsibility for maintaining order, delivering services, and ensuring that essential functions continued in the absence of networked systems. Emergency management relied on manual planning, preparation, and response. Communities established local response teams, trained in analog coordination methods. Communication chains were created with phone lines, radios, and in-person reporting. Resource allocation, evacuation planning, and disaster drills were organized using physical maps, logs, and face-to-face coordination. Resilience became a matter of human organization, careful attention, and preparedness, rather than reliance on digital alerts or automated monitoring. The psychological adjustment to the new pace was profound. Without the constant stimulation and instant feedback of the internet, individuals experienced a slower, more reflective mental rhythm. Attention spans lengthened, and activities that required concentration regained prominence. Patience and deliberation became essential skills, applied to learning, work, and social interaction. People discovered the value of waiting, planning, and observing, rediscovering mental habits that had been eroded by the rapidity of digital life. Community rebuilding emphasized cooperation and resource sharing. Local groups organized to manage food distribution, healthcare support, education, and infrastructure maintenance. Neighbors helped each other maintain homes, gardens, and businesses. Public spaces became central points for gathering, exchange, and information dissemination. Mutual aid and collective responsibility replaced the dispersed coordination once mediated through online platforms. Communities learned to operate through collaboration, face-to-face interaction, and shared effort. Economically, small enterprises adapted to local demand and human-driven logistics. Retailers managed inventories manually, delivered goods using coordinated physical transport, and maintained paper records for accounting. Manufacturing adjusted schedules according to available labor and local resource access rather than remote digital management. Supply chains were simplified and localized, emphasizing reliability over efficiency. Barter and direct trade emerged as complementary systems to monetary exchange in areas where digital banking was unavailable. Trust, reputation, and personal accountability became central to transactions. Agricultural communities, small businesses, and artisans relied on observation and experience rather than algorithms or data feeds. Planning for planting, production, and sales required human judgment. Local coordination meetings replaced digital scheduling, allowing direct negotiation and problem-solving. Communities that were proactive in developing analog systems for tracking resources, managing schedules, and maintaining supplies became more resilient. Knowledge was preserved through documentation, repetition, and teaching rather than relying on instant digital retrieval. Psychologically, humans adapted to the slower pace by valuing sustained attention, direct engagement, and patience. Individuals became less reactive to every stimulus, focusing instead on deliberate action and observation. Families and communities noticed a renewed emphasis on presence, listening, and conversation. Activities that had previously been interrupted or shortened by digital notifications were now approached with intention and depth. The absence of constant online distraction fostered a renewed appreciation for tangible experience, human connection, and thoughtful reflection. Social cohesion improved in localized networks. People invested time and effort in maintaining relationships, assisting neighbors, and participating in communal decisions. Public spaces, local events, and civic engagement took on heightened importance. Communities organized around mutual interests, shared goals, and collective responsibility, filling gaps left by the absence of digital platforms. Social networks, once global and virtual, were replaced with tangible, face-to-face systems that prioritize reliability, cooperation, and trust. Education, commerce, healthcare, emergency management, and governance all adapted to rely on low-tech, human-centered systems. Knowledge was preserved through printed records, memory, and local expertise. Supply chains, communications, and administrative operations functioned through direct human management. Daily life became more deliberate, slower, and intentional, emphasizing patience, observation, and engagement. People learned to navigate complexity without instantaneous feedback, reconstructing functional systems through effort, coordination, and ingenuity. This phase of adaptation demonstrated resilience. Despite the abrupt loss of digital infrastructure, humans reconstructed methods for living, learning, working, and cooperating. Communities became more self-reliant. Institutions relied on human diligence, and individuals cultivated habits of patience, focus, and attentiveness. While efficiency decreased and speed of operations slowed, the capacity to function, survive, and maintain social cohesion persisted. Human society proved capable of reorganizing around manual systems, low-tech solutions, and deliberate engagement, sustaining life and continuity in a world suddenly offline. Over time, the experience of adaptation fostered a recognition of dependency on digital systems. People became aware of the fragility of networks they had once taken for granted. This awareness encouraged the development of redundant analog strategies, physical record keeping, and human-centered coordination. Communities, organizations, and individuals learned to plan for continuity without relying on instantaneous digital access, strengthening resilience, ingenuity, and collective problem-solving in ways that would shape society long after the Internet vanished. As the immediate challenges of living without the Internet gradually receded, society began to reflect on the depth of its previous dependence. Humans had lived for decades in a world mediated by an invisible web, one that shaped behavior, thought, and interaction without being seen. People realized that life had become contingent on systems that operated silently, carrying information across continents, sustaining commerce, enabling governance, and even preserving memory. The sudden absence of this network revealed how intertwined it had become with every aspect of daily existence, and how fragile such reliance could be. Communities noticed that life without constant connectivity encouraged deliberate action. Decisions were made slowly, with careful attention to observation and judgment. Social interaction relied on presence, conversation, and shared experience rather than digital messaging. Local knowledge regained importance as human observation and memory replaced instantaneous global feeds. People remembered neighbors, routines, and physical landmarks in ways that had been dulled by reliance on digital prompts. There was a sense of clarity in the deliberate pace of activity, even as efficiency had declined. Patience became a skill, not a burden, and engagement became sustained rather than fleeting. Analog skills, once considered quaint or outdated, returned to practical relevance. People who could read maps, maintain mechanical systems, or track inventories manually became invaluable. Trades that required hands-on expertise, whether in agriculture, transportation, or maintenance, gained renewed attention. Printing, record-keeping, and manual computation were essential for coordinating community life, commerce, and governance. The mastery of processes that had once been outsourced to digital devices became a source of stability and competence. Knowledge became embedded in human practice rather than in servers and networks. Education and culture embraced the balance of reflection, observation, and direct participation. Students and learners engaged with materials in ways that demanded attention, comprehension, and interpretation. Printed books, physical archives, and in-person instruction restored skills of memory, analysis, and critical thinking. Communities became custodians of knowledge, with libraries, workshops, and local experts sharing information directly. Cultural practices, storytelling, and music thrived in live settings, reinforcing human creativity and cooperation. The absence of instant digital dissemination revealed that knowledge and culture could persist without networks, though in slower, more grounded ways. Economies adjusted to accommodate resilience over speed. Cash and barter systems complemented physical record-keeping and direct trade. Supply chains emphasized redundancy and human oversight. Local production and distribution were strengthened, while global networks became secondary or adaptive. Communities developed strategies to maintain stability, with contingency plans, stockpiles, and shared resources. The lessons of dependence highlighted the importance of resilience in addition to efficiency. Human ingenuity, organization, and cooperation proved capable of sustaining society even when digital support vanished. Governance and security evolved to integrate analog practices with strategic awareness. Decision-making balanced careful deliberation with practical knowledge of local conditions. Communication relied on verified human channels and structured processes. Critical infrastructure operated through hands-on management and routine inspection. National security, intelligence, and defense adapted to slower but deliberate methods, emphasizing observation, redundancy, and human judgment. Society discovered that digital networks, while powerful, were not the sole guarantors of stability or safety. Psychologically, humans experienced a renewed sense of agency. Life without constant digital input encouraged reflection, mindfulness, and observation. Individuals became attentive to immediate surroundings, personal relationships, and tangible experiences. The pace of thought and action aligned with human capability rather than instantaneous digital demand. People cultivated patience, focus, and sustained engagement in daily routines. The collective consciousness shifted toward human-scale temporal rhythms, valuing presence over rapidity. In reflection, society acknowledged both the power and the risk of invisible networks. The Internet had enabled unprecedented global communication, knowledge sharing, and coordination. At the same time, reliance on a system that could vanish in an instant revealed vulnerability. Humans recognized the necessity of balancing technological connectivity with skills, practices, and infrastructures that could endure disruption. Analog knowledge, local expertise, and manual processes were no longer secondary. They were essential for continuity, resilience, and stability. Looking forward, the future offered the possibility of equilibrium between connectivity and preparedness. Systems could be designed to leverage the advantages of digital networks while preserving independent methods of operation. Communities might maintain offline archives, manual coordination procedures, and redundancy in critical processes. Individuals could cultivate skills that did not rely on instant digital support. Life could integrate speed with reliability, technology with human judgment, and global connection with local awareness. In the long-term perspective, society recognized that the experience of sudden disconnection had reshaped priorities. Human attention, cooperation, and observation gained renewed value. Education, work, governance, and culture adapted to embrace deliberate, hands-on engagement. Communities became more self-reliant, resilient, and attentive to local conditions. The absence of the Internet, once catastrophic, ultimately illuminated strengths that had been obscured by constant digital connectivity. Humanity discovered that, even in a world once defined by invisible networks, it could endure, adapt, and rebuild with patience, skill, and collective effort. Through this reflection, it became clear that dependence on invisible systems carries both benefit and risk. Digital networks provide speed, efficiency, and connectivity, yet the experience of functioning without them reveals human resilience, ingenuity, and adaptability. Knowledge, commerce, governance, and social life can persist through human-centered processes, analog methods, and local networks. The lessons of absence shape a cautious optimism that society may one day achieve a balance between technological power and enduring human capability, preserving both connectivity and resilience for future generations.